We have created some SQL files that install our data warehouse. And in those SQL files, you will often find references to objects. So for example, here, create database, Northwind DW, or a reference to a specific file name. And then that's in the install folder for SQL Server on my PC. Maybe you want to dynamically set all these variables and change them according to your execution context or your execution time. You can do that by writing dynamic SQL code, and I'm going to show you an example right now. Here is my example of generating databases for the data warehouse dynamically. First, I declare all the variables that I'm going to be using, and I'm going to be using this SQL string in order to write up my SQL using the variables declared after. So since that's going to contain a lot of characters, I'm just setting that to invarchar max. Then I'm declaring the variable DB name, so that's the database name of my data warehouse. I should be able to do that within 100 characters, so invarchar 100 is fine. Then I'm declaring schema name 1, that's going to hold the name of my staged layer, and declaring schema name 2, that's going to hold the name of my EDW data layer. Now I'm setting all the variable names that I'm going to be using. So DB name, and in this case it's just test database data warehouse, then schema name 1 as stage, schema name 2 as EDW. And here's the fun part. So set SQL string, then this N and this small apostrophe, create database, that's going to be a string component, and then adding to that, so concatenating string with a variable name over here, DB name, referring back to test database data warehouse, using this function quote name around in order to avoid problems with SQL injection attacks. So if I just said concatenated with DB name, then that was gonna show up not as a string, but the whole SQL bit, and then you have a vulnerability for SQL injection attacks. So then by running this just with the print, I allow for you to see down here what that execute statement later is going to execute. That's going to execute this bit of the code. So create database, test database, data warehouse. So if I run this whole thing, I now have create database, test data warehouse. That's from this print statement, and then the completion time saying that it has been successfully completed. And we can do a refresh over here, test database, data warehouse. So now I'm just going to go ahead and out comment that because we don't want to run that again. Then in this next bit, I'm setting the SQL string to use, then quote name DB name use test database data warehouse, concatenating that with create schema and the first schema name. And let's do a print of that to see what that looks like. So that says use test database data warehouse, create schema. Now, if I go ahead and run this using the execute SQL string, it's going to give me an error. And that error is that create schema must be the first statement in a query batch. So this whole execute is the query batch. And as you can see, that has use test database data warehouse and then create schema. And it's not even going to work if I add a space here, because that's not the problem. The problem is that when it comes to create default, create function, create procedure, create rule, create schema, create trigger, and create views, those have to be the first in the query batch. So in order to fix that problem, and let's just go back up and delete that because that doesn't work. So in order to fix that problem, what I need to do is have it in a separate batch execution. And if I use these this way of escaping that character and yada, 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 then you can actually have two executions defined within one execute SQL string. And let me just show you what that's going to look like if I execute that. So it's use test database data warehouse and the semicolon that executes that, and then execute this bit. So that has a new execute statement that goes within this execute statement that I run here. So it shows up as the first in that batch. So it's a batch calling another batch, right? It's nested that way. So if I go ahead and execute this, then that's gonna fix all my problems and I'm gonna generate my schemas. So I'm just gonna go ahead and do that. Before I do that, actually, let me show you that right now under security and under schemas, I don't have the EDW and the stage schema, but if I go ahead and run this bit, they're gonna show up. So I go back, do a refresh, and security, schemas, EDW, and stage. So now I can dynamically set everything that I need to set dynamically in SQL, and you can go ahead and productionize your code real nice.